Yes, indeed. Thank you all so much. Good afternoon. I am very stoked to be here today. My name is Dave Johnson. Farmer Dave is what they call me at work, and even some of my friends call me Farmer Dave at this point. But I'm very stoked to be here. And honestly, as much as I wish that all of you had been to the farm before, I'm a little bit excited because that means I get to tell you about it. You know, you don't know what I'm going to talk about. So that's really cool. That's a cool opportunity. I was very excited to come here today. Before I get started, I'll tell you kind of a funny little story about how excited I was to come here today. I was so excited that I showed up 2 hours early for this presentation today. And I was walking towards the building at about 11 o'clock, and I looked at my calendar and I was like, oh, I'm early. So I had to go back to the farm, but now here we are. So, cool. Community Harvest Project. So as Mr. Maletta just said, we are an organization who farms. We operate 2 farms in Massachusetts. We have one in Grafton, which is about 15 acres. And we have an orchard out in Harvard, Massachusetts, where we have about 30 acres of apple trees. So anybody know how big an acre is? No? What do you think?
I don't know.
No, you don't know? All right.
Wait.
So, imagine like somewhere, oh, what do
A
you
football
think?
field.
All right, that's a good guess. What do you think?
2.5 football fields.
2.5 football fields? I would say that an acre is probably closer to maybe like 3/4 of a football field. All right? So if you think about that, if you think about the size of like a soccer field or a football field, you're in the ballpark of what we're talking about.
So like 75 yards?
75 yards long? Yeah, sure. Totally.
Sure.
So, in the grand scheme of things, we farm 15 of those in Grafton, primarily vegetables and some blueberries. And then out in Harvard, we have 30 acres of apple trees. So that's a lot of food production. Just to kind of talk about what we do and how we do it, this is our farm in Grafton. These are some cabbage plants that are here on the farm. We grow food, as Mr. Maletta said, not to sell it to grocery stores or to bring it to farmers markets, but to donate it to organizations that are working with people who are food insecure. Anyone know what food insecurity is? What do you think?
When you don't have food or possibly will run out very soon.
That is a perfect definition. I couldn't have asked for a better one. So we work with organizations that work and serve individuals who are food insecure for any number of reasons. People find themselves food insecure because they have limited resources, not enough money. People find themselves to be food insecure because they are experiencing medical conditions that are affecting their ability to feed themselves. We work with organizations that do all that, and we donate food to those organizations so that they can get them into the hands of people who need it. The coolest thing about our farm, I mean, I think that's a pretty cool thing in and of itself, right? When we donate about 300,000 pounds of food a year to organizations like that. That's not even the coolest thing. The coolest thing about the work that we do is we do it with the help of volunteers on the farm. You look at a picture like this and you might say to yourself, why do they have kids working on the farm? Well, it's because this is actually a field trip, and this is an opportunity to bring students to the farm. Like a lot of your peers, and maybe at some point in the future, you guys yourselves, it's an opportunity to come to the farm and not only learn about where food comes from and how we grow it, but also what we can do to take care of issues like food insecurity within our own communities. So all the food that we grow stays within our region. This is a picture right here of us loading pallets of vegetables onto, let's see whose truck that is. That's Community Serving. So that's an organization in Boston that makes meals for folks that are suffering from chronic illnesses. And they give those meals free to those people who need access to that nutrition. So if you think about a farm like ours, you said it kind of at the beginning, all of our work is outside for the most part, right? We grow these vegetables outside, we grow these apples outside. What do you think is the biggest thing that we deal with that impacts the work we do going on in the world today? What do you think?
Winter,
Winter is a good example. What do you think?
climate change.
Climate change, yes, and those 2 things are connected for sure. Climate change, exactly. So who can give me a definition of climate change? What have you guys been learning about? You got one? Global warming, that's part of climate change. Is that a hand up?
Yep.
What do you think?
It's like the climate changes in like usually a worse way.
Yep, okay, so it's climate changing for the worst. What do you think?
An overload of released chemicals, toxins, that impact ecosystems.
That's a really good answer. Here's a definition that I found. This is from NASA, so I feel like they've got a pretty good handle when you're thinking of in a global sense of what it is we're dealing with. This definition says significant changes in global temperature, precipitation, wind patterns, and other measures of climate that occur over several decades or longer. So when we look at those things, temperature, precipitation, like the rain we just had, wind patterns, and other measures of climate, I mean, that's like everything that affects my job on a daily basis. When we can plant things, whether those things survive through the season, whether or not we can bring people out into the fields to do the work that we need to do, and actually being able to harvest those vegetables and fruits, all of these things impact that. So, what are some examples of climate change impacts that you think we might see on the farm? Anybody have any ideas? Like, what are some of the things that go along with climate change that you've been learning about that you think would impact the farm operation? Right back here.
Droughts.
Drought, really good example. So that is my first example. It's like you reading my slideshow. So yes, drought is a really wonderful example. The problems that we deal with on the farm related to drought, like we had last year was a pretty significant drought in our region. We were dealing with limited water availability on the farm, so there's just not as much water resources for us to utilize. The rain isn't falling as much, and even the groundwater, because it's not being recharged by that rain and that precipitation, the groundwater level drops as well. And so even our well sometimes can go dry, which is where we pull our irrigation water from. Here's a really interesting one. Increased damage from pests like deer, woodchucks, and birds. So we deal with a lot of pests on the farm. But this is a unique class of pests because and I know, deer are cute. That's a really cute deer. It's a cute pest, right? Why do you think pests like deer and woodchucks and birds become more of a problem when we have a drought? Right here.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, because there's less food out in the wild.
That is exactly right. You guys have been teaching my lesson here. This is awesome. That is exactly right. So we were experiencing last year deer eating plants that deer wouldn't normally eat. Deer don't usually like to eat things that are fuzzy and will tickle their noses, which is kind of cute and funny. But they were even going after like squash plants and tomato plants, which are plants that they would normally steer clear of simply because they didn't have access to as much food as they would normally be able to forage in the wild, right? We also deal with heat damage on crops. So when we have extreme heat events and things like that, or when we're not being able to water quite as much as we would, the leaf canopy on our vegetables is not quite as strong, and so our vegetables are exposed to the hot sun, and you can pick tomatoes and peppers and eggplants that have like sunburn, basically. Just like we burn, vegetable skins will burn as well. And then another one which, we can't really, we can't get around is worker safety. Worker safety is a significant challenge on a farm in general because a lot of our work happens over the course of the summer, but in a drought and in major heat events, it's even more so. Keeping people hydrated, people being able to work the amount of time that we need to be able to work in the field to harvest the crops and get them to people who need it, we have to really be mindful of worker safety in conditions like this. Yeah? What is another example of a climate change impact that we might see on the farm? Right? Floods, yes, you guys are awesome. All right, increased rainfall, which
I did not show them the slides.
Yeah, right. You handed out printouts with slides. Increased rainfall, absolutely, and the flooding that results as a result of increased rainfall. The biggest challenge that we have when we're dealing with increased rainfall on the farm is plant disease. So a lot of you guys probably know, right? Like if your basement is wet, if your basement floods, I don't know if any of you experience that, but what happens, right? Like what happens, why is it bad to have your basement flood other than the pain that it is to have water in your basement?
It gets like musty and moldy.
Yes, fungi will grow in wet conditions, wet and dank conditions, bacteria as well. And there are a whole range of fungi and bacteria that act as plant diseases and in many cases can completely wipe out an entire crop. So last year was a drought. The previous year we had extreme rainfall. I think that July we saw 13 inches of rain just in that month alone. And that year we had a real challenge where most of our tomato plants died on the farm. Tomatoes can be particularly susceptible to disease. And tomatoes actually make up the grand majority of what we grow at our Grafton farm in terms of weight and nutrition. And unfortunately, our numbers were really low that year simply because of the wet conditions. This is another interesting one, nutrient availability. You guys learn about soil science at all?
Yeah.
Components that are within the soil. So the thing to understand, which you may already know about, is that it's not so much that the plants eat the soil, but it's the components of the soil that the plants will consume for their nutrients. And some of those nutrients are what we call water soluble, which means that they will dissolve in water, they'll break down in water, and if there's a lot of water, they will actually flow away, they'll leach away. And these are like really key nutrients to most plants. And so when we have flood events or major rainfall, I mean, we all know that plants need water, right? But when we have flood events or major rainfall, what we experience is sometimes those nutrients will go away and they're no longer in the soil where we need them to be for the plants. They'll just kind of flow away, they'll flow downhill. I know you guys are learning about watersheds. All those nutrients just end up in the local watershed, right? Flooding, like you said, flooding just creates hazards. The other interesting thing that flooding causes, which is kind of the results down below, poor crop quality, is that although plants like water, and there are certainly wetland plants or aquatic plants that want to be in water all the time, most of the plants in our gardens or on the farm, they only want so much water. They want the right amount of water. They can be pretty finicky. And what is interesting about it is that when you think about the soil that the plants grow in, you've got the soil structure, you've got the nutrients there, you've got water there. Other thing that roots need is oxygen. Roots need oxygen to be able to grow. And what happens is when plants are sitting in flooded fields, there's no oxygen in the soil. They call that anaerobic. It goes anaerobic, and you can even smell it. There's a whole range of like bacteria and fungi that form in an anaerobic environment, and that's what we start to combat. And the roots will actually start to die, and our plants will stop growing, and in some cases will die altogether. So it can be a real challenge. All right, one more example of, and they're kind of related to these things, but what's one more example, like an overarching example of climate change impact that we might experience on a farm? Back here.
Drastic temperature changes?
Drastic temperature changes, that, you showed them this. So unpredictable weather events, but yes, you're exactly right. So frost is on one end of the spectrum, the other end of the spectrum is extreme heat, and we've experienced both. And I'll give you some examples. I don't know if you all remember back in February, we had a cold night that got down really cold. Yeah.
It's night out that day.
Unbelievable. So I'll tell you the impact of that on our farm. Everybody, listen up. At our orchard out in Harvard, Mass, we have peach trees. The frost that night, when that extreme frost event happened, actually killed all the buds on the peach trees, which means that we will not have a peach crop this year on the farm. And that was just one night of impact, extreme cold. And our entire peach crop is wiped out for the year. Now, fortunately, these trees are resilient, and that didn't kill the trees, but it means that we will not actually be able to harvest and donate peaches this year. Similarly, and a lot of orchards have experienced this in the past, us included, our trees are just starting to open their blossoms, which, if you don't know, those blossoms is what turns into the fruit once they're pollinated by pollinators. Once those blossoms open, they can be very susceptible to temperature changes. They usually open right around this time of year when the danger of frost is almost gone, but if we get an unseasonable or an unpredictable frost event, you'll end up with what this looks like right here. This is a frost-damaged apple blossom. And that means that blossom, unless it's already been pollinated, that blossom won't be able to produce an apple this year. On the other end of the spectrum, we have extreme heat events, which we've experienced in the past. We experienced some of this last year. And I think one of the most interesting impacts, we already talked about some of the effects of like drought and extreme heat, but one of the most interesting impacts of extreme heat in particular is the effect that it has on insect populations on the farm. I was talking about pests before, and one of the sets of pests that we deal with are insect pests. There are a lot of bugs that love to eat the same kinds of food that we do, or the plants that grow those food. And one of the things that insects are very sensitive to is temperature. When they have warmth and when they have heat available to them, it causes them to get excited, it causes them to be more active, it causes them to be active for longer periods of the day, and it also causes them to reproduce more. And so what happens is the populations of insects on the farm exponentially grow, right? So that means that we've just got more and more and more pests to deal with, and that can be a real challenge. So this is hard, right? Like, I've chosen this job where I go out and I farm every day, and I've got all of these things that are outside of my control that I have to contend with, and can sometimes, like, no matter my best efforts, can sometimes make it so that we're not able to accomplish the goals that we have to accomplish. And not only that, but I know you guys have been learning this, and one of the things we've been experiencing is that these things have been getting worse. This is not just like, you know, it's going to be like this from now on, and so we can just figure out ways around it. This actually is continuing to change over time, hence the name climate change. So what do we do about it? What do we do about it? Anybody have an idea? Think.
I remember back in our Latin America unit, it was said that the Amazon rainforest, if they stopped woodlogging, it could be a greenhouse gas sink, kind of, towards climate change.
Absolutely. So there are things on a global scale, on an industrial scale, that could be changed to maybe slow down or affect the onset of climate change, right? But today, this year, as we're farming and we've got these potential events that we're trying to navigate around on the farm so that we can accomplish our goal of getting food into the community, you know, we still have to accomplish that goal regardless of what they choose to do down in the Amazon, right? Or regardless of whether or not our dependence on fossil fuels continues in the world. Any ideas about what I can do? What do you think?
Maybe, I don't know if you already do this, you probably are, but you could try to be more sustainable in the process. Maybe like when you're using pesticide to kill the pests, you can be more sustainable in a way, so in the future it's easier for you.
That's a really good point, and I'm going to get to that actually, that kind of thing, close to the end. What we do is we develop a climate adaptation plan. There's a lot of words on this slide, but I'll talk us through it. This is really just a picture that kind of lays out what's over there in that yellow box. So a climate adaptation plan. We develop plans for everything on the farm. We develop a crop plan that decides what we're going to grow, where we're going to grow it, how we're going to grow it. We develop a pest management plan that determines like how and when we're going to deal with the pests that we experience on the farm. And so as this challenge presents itself to us, we've now developed a climate adaptation plan. This is a process that we went through that the United States Department of Agriculture has developed for farmers to utilize. And it's a really, really cool process because I think sometimes when we think about climate change, especially as individuals and as families, and we think about what we can do about climate change, it can feel a little overwhelming sometimes, right? You know, we think about in our lives like, what can I do? And we think about all the things that we would need to change in our lives to affect climate change. What we're trying to do in this scenario is we're trying to adapt to the changes in climate that we are experiencing. And where that process starts is by defining goals and objectives. So we as an organization have two goals and objectives: to grow as much food as humanly possible on the land that we have, and to do that with the help of as many volunteers as we possibly can, right? So that's our goal and objective. And then we want to look at our impacts, so vulnerabilities and opportunities, and that is key. We often think about the really challenging things that climate change presents us with, but on a practical level on the farm, there are also things when we're in a drought that, you know, we think about the things that we experience with increased rainfall. Well, those problems don't exist as much when we have a drought year, and vice versa. And so we want to assess not only the things that are vulnerable in our operation, but also the opportunities that these changes are presenting us with. We want to evaluate those goals and objectives after we've thought about the impacts and say to ourselves, okay, is this goal and objective still possible? And then we want to identify adaptation strategies. So what are the things that we're going to do? How can we address the vulnerabilities, the things that are making our day harder? And how can we maximize the opportunities, take advantage of the things that climate change is presenting us with that will actually, in some ways, make our lives easier, right? We want to monitor effectiveness. We want to monitor that so that we know how we're doing. And what we also know is that this is cyclical. So that arrow doesn't end at when it gets past 5 and starts at 1. It continues as a cycle because, as we know, climate is changing. So we need to be ready to adapt and continue to change, and this plan changes with it. Let's look at some examples. Go back to drought. So what I've put here is an example of one of their vulnerabilities that we talked about, limited water availability. So when there's a drought, the water tables are low, we're not getting as much precipitation, and we have fewer water resources to work with to water our crops, right? So the adaptation strategy, we're going to use drip irrigation and water storage to use as little water as possible for irrigation. So this goes to kind of what you were saying about sustainability. This is an opportunity for us to use a method of irrigation that isn't just kind of throwing water like a sprinkler all over the weeds and the plants and all over everything and evaporating into the air. We use a system of drip lines like that hose you see there, which is right next to the plant. It drips the water at a slow rate right where the roots are, where the plants need it. And we also, if you've seen this on other farms before, we use a plastic mulch that covers the garden beds that keeps that water in the soil so it doesn't just evaporate off into the air. It'll evaporate, hit the plastic, and then get absorbed back in. A cool thing to note is that last year we piloted the use of biodegradable plastic on the farm for the first time, and it was an awesome experiment, and we're going to be expanding use of that on the farm this year. So, the opportunity that a drought provides us with is that it limits the spread of plant disease. So one of the things I remember about last year is that I spent a lot of the year kind of stressed about our water and where it was going to come from and whether or not we would have enough. But I didn't really have to think about diseases too much last year. I didn't have to think about hooking up the sprayer and going out to spray a fungicide to kill a fungal disease because that just was not really present on the farm as much last year. And so that's an opportunity, and we want to take advantage of that, and we want to acknowledge that, right? Let's look at the next one. Increased rainfall. So, on the flip side of what we were just talking about, wet conditions are perfect for the spread of plant diseases. When the air is humid, when there's not as much like wind blowing, when things are wet all the time, fungal and bacterial diseases can run rampant in the farm. So we have some adaptation strategies that we've developed, right? We plant disease-resistant varieties. Anybody have an idea what that means? What do you think?
Like the types of plants you use are more like they don't get diseases as easily.
Absolutely, absolutely. So there are countless individuals, a lot of colleges and research organizations that are doing work with plant breeding to find varieties of plants that are less susceptible. So in the past, we just grew the type of tomato that we wanted to grow because it looked nice, because it tasted good, because it grew well. Well, that variety wasn't as disease resistant as it could be. We've now, through a little bit of testing and like trying out different varieties, found varieties of tomatoes that are far more disease resistant but still produce as awesome of a tomato as we want, right? This is a really cool one. This is like one of my favorite things about what we do at the farm. We fight biology with biology. And this isn't the only example of where we do it, but that little picture you see inset there, that creature is a fungus called, and I don't know about my pronunciation, so don't blame me, but Trichoderma harzianum. That sound right? That sound right? So this fungus right here is amazing in the way that it forms a relationship with a plant. And it protects the plant from other microbiological diseases. So this is a product, the actual product is called Root Shield. It's a living product. We put it in the water, and when we plant our seeds in the greenhouse, we water those plants with this product. And what it is, it's a safe product, you know, like you can use it on the day of harvest even and still eat that vegetable and it's just fine. It's not harmful to humans, but what it does is it forms a lifelong relationship with those plants so that even when you put them out in the field, they have an immune system that is boosted by the presence of that organism. That's pretty cool, right? We have another similar product that we use to deal with like caterpillars that eat like cabbages and things. There's bacteria that will target those caterpillars, but they don't really affect anything else like bees or anything. Really, really cool. So we're like using like allies in biology to do the work we need to do. The opportunity, which I think is a little bit obvious, is that we don't need to irrigate nearly as much in a year where we have increased rainfall. So that year, I didn't turn the water on at all that July, back in 2022, or 2021, because we just didn't need to. There was so much water falling from the sky that we didn't need to provide any. That gave us an opportunity to store up resources for a later date when it was going to be limited. Increased unpredictable weather patterns. So you were someone mentioned, I think it was over here. You mentioned like extreme divergence in temperature. So extreme heat caused insect pest populations to increase and thrive. So the adaptation strategy there is that we proactively address pest problems based on conditions. And so what this means, right, I mentioned that we develop a pest management plan. Part of developing a pest management plan is deciding when you're actually going to do something about a problem. You know, you might not necessarily hook up the sprayer and get out a product to spray on the crops to deal with a pest when you've seen just one of them. You decide a threshold, like I want to see this many before I start actually dealing with the problem. Well, sometimes this adaptation strategy prompts us to go back to that plan and rethink it a little bit based on conditions. If we're experiencing unpredictable weather patterns like extreme heat events, I might go out and start trying to deal with pests knowing that they're going to come because of the conditions. So I might change my plan a little bit, so I'm not waiting to see the pest arrive and infest the crop before I do something about it. In many cases, if we're getting extreme weather events, we'll get ready and start preparing to deal with those pests because we know they're coming. So we proactively do that. And then this is the other really cool one, and this is linked directly to the opportunity, is that we increase habitat and support for beneficial insects. Because the opportunity here is that these conditions not only affect pest insect populations, but also beneficial insect populations. Bees love heat, butterflies love heat, spiders love heat. So one of the things that we will do on the farm is a range of activities, whether it be planting pollinator gardens, bringing bees to the farm, or even just creating habitat around the farm for these beneficial organisms to be able to survive and thrive on the farm. Pretty cool, yeah? One of the things that we have learned, though, in all cases when we're thinking of adaptation strategies is that some of the biggest challenges come when we kind of put all of our eggs into one basket. So that year where we had disease go through and wipe out our tomato crop, you know, the way that happens, right, is you've got a tomato plant right here that's got the disease, and you've got a tomato plant right here, its neighbor. This plant, just like if someone in class has a cold or something like that, this plant's going to get it from this plant. And one of the things that we used to do is we used to plant everything in just big, large blocks, so an entire acre of tomato plants. Well, if you do that and you get a disease on one end of the field, before too long it's going to move through the whole field. So one of the lessons we learned that year is we can take those crops and we can break them up and move them around the farm. So we might do 5 rows of tomatoes here, we might do 5 rows of tomatoes over there, 5 rows of tomatoes over there. And then what happens is if we do end up in a situation where this planting gets wiped out by a disease or severely impacted, we've got these others to work with. The other thing we do is what's called succession planting. Anybody know what that is? Any ideas? Succession planting is when you not just plant something once in the spring, but you actually continue to plant it throughout the season. So you're not really depending upon just one planting. And this actually has a twofold benefit. One is that, again, like if we plant our tomatoes, say in March, so that we can put them out in the ground in May. That's one planting of tomatoes. If that gets wiped out, we can also plant a second planting, say in April, that we'll put out in the ground in June. And what it really means is that if that first planting, if any one of those plantings experiences a problem, it's not the only one that we have to rely on, right? If we put all of our eggs in one basket, if that basket falls to the ground, all the eggs will break, right? But if we kind of divvy up those plantings into smaller packages, if one of them experiences the impact, we have the other one to go back to. Does that make sense? Cool. Does anyone have any questions for me about what we do on the farm? What do you think?
Do you use any kinds of pesticides?
We do. So, I'm glad you asked that question. This is a question I love to answer. So we, as a farm, particularly in Grafton, so we use all organic pesticides. So what that means is that these are products that we buy, just like that Root Shield product that I was talking about. These are products that we buy. We do use a sprayer to apply them. Sometimes we put them through the irrigation system. These are products that are designed for organic vegetable production. And so what that means is when these products break down in the soil or when they run off, they break down into organic, natural ingredients that basically are not going to be harmful. That said, it is really important for, like, when I'm applying a product to know who it's going to impact. You know, if I'm using even an organic insecticide, you know, a product that kills insect pests, well, bees are also insects. And so that product, unless it's very, very targeted, like that one I mentioned that targets the caterpillars, unless it's very targeted, this product is also going to impact bees. So that means I have to make decisions about when and where I spray that product. I don't want to spray a crop that is flowering. I don't want to split, because bees will be in there after the flowers. I don't want to be spraying next to a field that's flowering, even with wild-type flowers. A lot of times to protect pollinators, you might apply products like that on a cloudy day, or you might do it early in the morning or in the evening when they're not active. So, yeah, it's a really good question.
When you were talking about the nutrient availability, where the nutrients would just get washed away and the photosynthesis would be hard, would you, for the solution, would you just have to plant a whole new line of maybe the tomatoes or like cabbage, or would you like do something, would you put something in the plant, or what would you do?
That's also a really good question. So, there are different ways to deliver nutrients to plants. When I started at Community Harvest Project, the system that was in place was called fertigation, which can be a really powerful tool for farmers. Fertigation is when you put your nutrients in the water and then you water your plants with that fertilizer, right? By nature of them being in water means that they're water soluble. And so if you have a lot of rain events, or if you miss an application day, that nutrient's not going to stick around. The other ways of applying nutrients are to use either like a mineral-based fertilizer or like a manure-based fertilizer or something like that, which is more of a time release. And so what it means is you can change what nutrient sources you use so that they will release and become available to the plants over time. They'll stay locked up and will release and become available to the plants over time, as opposed to just relying on them being available all at once. And so even if we experience a single severe rain event, or even a couple, it's not going to leach away our entire nutrient bank that we've built up for those plants. And that's what we've started to do on the farm. That's what we do, how we do everything back here.
Has it ever happened that one of the diseases that hits one of the crops in that particular area, it spreads around to your other crop areas?
Yeah.
And to the whole farm eventually?
Yeah, we haven't experienced diseases that have gone across the entire farm, but there are certain plant pathogens that will affect multiple crops. So an example of that is a fungal disease called Alternaria. And it's a disease that can affect cabbage, it can affect broccoli, it can affect collard greens and kale, but it can also affect things like squashes and tomatoes and things like that. And we have dealt with issues like that on the farm, and they can be very, very hard to deal with once they come in. Right? Perfect. Yeah.
So how old does someone have to be to work on the farm on a daily basis?
I'm so glad you asked that question. So, to be an employee at our farm, you have to be 18. But the cool thing about our farm, like I mentioned, is that we bring volunteers to the farm. So starting this Saturday is our first volunteer day at the farm. And we start planting out in the field. I think we're planting broccoli on Saturday. And we schedule groups to come, just like your classmates from Mill Pond here. But we also allow people to just show up, and we'll put you to work Monday through Saturday. You can come in, and our volunteer shift is 9 to 12. Now, for you, it would be great if you came with an adult, but you could totally come your age. We have parents would show up with kids on their back, strapped to their back. We've had 4-year-olds picking tomatoes out in the field before. So there's no real age limit. The only age limit really kicks in if we're talking about if someone was just going to drop you off. So if you came with an adult, we'd love to have you come and help out. Yeah, right here.
What happens to your farm in winter?
Ooh, that's a really great question. So there are a couple of different things that go on in the winter. One thing that I will say is to farm a farm this big, and also to farm the way we do with volunteers. It's not like I just have a crew of people and a bunch of tractors and I just tell people what to do. We invite thousands of people to our farm over the course of the season, and that requires a ton of time. So we spend the winter planning what we're going to grow and how we're going to grow it, and then we look at that crop plan and we decide we think that means this many volunteers on these weeks, and that we spend the winter pretty much planning. What we have started to do is extend our season, so we are doing some growing during the winter as well. So we started growing garlic a couple of years ago. We plant garlic in November, and it grows all through the winter, and we harvest it in July. We just submitted a grant application to get money so that we can build a structure really similar to this greenhouse right here, but actually in the field. So this is up by our building, and it's got tables for trays of plants that we plant in the spring. But what a lot of farmers, and you may have seen this before, they call it a high tunnel. They will put a structure like this, a greenhouse structure, actually in the field and plant right in the ground under that cover. And in many areas of the country, here included, you can grow all winter long outside using a structure like that. And so that's something that we've kind of got on our radar for the future. All right, right here and then right over here.
When did this program start?
This program, I'm so glad I was there too. These are such good questions. So our program in Grafton is 21 years old. Last year was our 20-year anniversary at that location. This program started in the town of Hopkinton, and it started as a labor of love from a couple named Bill and Rose, and they had acreage on their farm in Hopkinton, and they wanted to use that property to grow food for the Worcester County Food Bank. And so they started this as a very small grassroots effort. They invited friends and volunteers to come and work with them, and that grew into the organization that we are today.
Where do you receive your the water or like the seeds for the plants from?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we buy our seeds for the most part. Sometimes we save them when we can. Certain crops we're able to save our seed. We buy our seeds primarily from a company in Maine called Johnny's. There are lots of great seed companies. I like Johnny's because they're in Maine, so it means a lot of their seed testing has been done for the Northeast. You know, they do their work even north of us. And so they've had good luck with a pepper or tomato variety that I feel pretty good about us being able to grow here. And that's one more right back here.
Have you ever experienced like a natural disaster like an earthquake or a tornado?
No, I personally have not, and our farm has not either. You know, we've experienced sort of like deluge of 13 inches of rain over the course of a month, but never like a really extreme weather event that would be destructive to the level that you're talking about. Cool. I think we're good, yeah.
Yeah, I think we're about to end anyway, but guys, round of applause.